Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carey Nieuwhof here, and I've got David Kinnaman. David, it's great to be doing another one of these episodes together.
Absolutely. Good to see you, Carey.
Good to see you too. And, we had a few technical difficulties. It's funny how you take technology for granted until it breaks.
Right. I know. It's so true.
We had a power outage, and I think I fried I don't know what you call it, mixer or something like that, my Scarlett. For any podcaster knows what that is. But anyway, here we are. And we've got Rachel Cruze, who's going to join us in a few minutes, which we're very excited for. She's one of my favorite leaders and writers and thinkers about money because she's so practical and so in it. And so we're going to talk about personal finance, giving, spending habits, debt levels, and so much more. But you've got some stats you want to share with us as well.
I do. I'm happy to. And first, thanks again to listeners. It's been more than a year and a half now since we've been coming into your hearts and ear pods and all the rest, and recognizing that the world feels so different. I saw your recent post about like 2019 is dead, and we're definitely in that new zone of recognizing that so much of
what do you think about that? Do we need to just declare all the metrics from 2019 as historic data and move on and start measuring fresh?
I think so. I mean, we've been grappling with that here at Barna when it comes to how you measure church attendance. In the past, sort of the gold standard for measuring church attendance was in the past 7 days, have you attended a church? And right. So we've had to rejigger all of those kinds of things about in-person attendance, and then sort of like all the baselines have been reset. And I've said this on the podcast, but it's like I feel like I've spent 25 years practicing for the last 18 months in terms of the amount of social change. And none of us have enjoyed going through the pandemic and all the resulting change or the political challenges or the racial unrest. But for me as a researcher, it's been quite a fun experience to see how much can be up for grabs and how some things change and some things don't change. And on that note, when it comes to finances, we're here to talk today a little bit about that. But I want to start with this idea of church giving. So especially for younger generations, one of the many ways that they have coped with the financial uncertainty during the pandemic has been reducing the amount of money that they give to church. So they admit that they are doing that. 25% of practicing Christian millennials and 20% of practicing Christian Gen X said in the early days of the pandemic that they had reduced the amount of money they were giving to their church. And for most of those individuals, that has not returned. So what we're hearing from a lot of churches is that giving is staying more stable than in-person attendance. Mm-hmm. But I think there's some just flashing yellow sort of signs on the dashboard related to giving. And one of them is that giving among younger generations, they're not the majority of the givers at this moment, but the next 3 to 5 years, we've talked a lot about the habit forming nature of the pandemic, how it changes the way we orient towards our spending, our money, our giving, our church attendance, our leisure habits, our working from home. Every workplace virtually is, sort of changed in the last year and a half because it sort of shows that so much can be up for grabs. Sort of people that said you've got to come into the office to do the work. It's like that's sort of it feels like a very time whose an idea whose time has passed now. So anyway, lots of interesting things related to
the one thought, and I want to bring Rachel on sooner rather than later, but while we're going through these stats, I think about what Tony Morgan says about the life cycle of a church. And one of the signs pre-pandemic that your church was heading into maintenance mode and out of growth was that your growth was kind of stagnant, but you had lots of money in the bank and lots of volunteers. And a lot of churches go, well, at least we solved the financial crisis and at least we got a lot of volunteers. But he said that's actually usually a first sign of decline, which is interesting. So I don't know what to do with the fact that giving is generally holding steady. Younger generations are kind of reducing. And obviously there's a volunteer crisis in most churches too right now. But it's funny, it's hard to know how to read the scoreboard. By the way, if you're wondering where you can find that article that David referenced, just search 2019 is dead and my name, and I'm sure you'll find it. But that's the argument I'm making, is looking at old metrics is less and less helpful. The longer this goes, the more it's just discouraging, because you're going to spend all your time trying to go back to where you were, not ahead into the future. So Anyway, really, really interesting finding. What else have we found, David?
Well, one other just note on that is, I've spent a fair amount of time in the UK, Australia, and I think in some ways what we're seeing in the US, I mean, there's been this argument for a long time that, America's sort of on the slippery slope in terms of social values and attitudes.
Right.
And some argue that we're completely exceptional, which is in some ways true, that the amount of affluence and religiosity and Christian commitment is completely unique to the US experience. And that's been true. What I notice is that it feels to me like that the pandemic accelerated this sort of loss of engagement, and that we're more and more like the UK church, where we just don't have the kind of the people, the programs, the financial resources to sustain the buildings and all the things that we think were so necessary before the pandemic. So I think that's an interesting, we'll sort of see where things land in the next 3 to 5 years, but maybe this sort of accelerates some of those things that push us, that reveals some of the underlying secularization that has been happening. A lot of good social research is showing that we're actually accelerating, not on the path to Europe exactly, to Western Europe, but we certainly have some of those kinds of things that are taking place. So another key stat, I'll wrap these two stats together. One is on financial stress, and then the other on spending habits. And we found in the research that 14% of adults, this was taken just a few months ago, that 14% of adults and 18% of practicing Christians, so that's 1 in 7 adults and about 1 in every 5 Christians, express that they've experienced substantial disruption to their income as a result of COVID-19. So that's a huge number when you look at the absolute numbers, the tens of millions of Americans who've been affected in a substantial way, the millions of practicing Christians who've been affected. 15% of adults today, 1 in 7, report extreme levels of stress related to their personal finances. Spending habits as a result of COVID-19, 2 in every 5 Americans, and just about half of practicing Christians said that they paid more attention to their spending habits due to the pandemic. Now, to me, that almost sounds like, well, why wouldn't you? And what's wrong with the other half of people who didn't pay attention to their spending habits? But it was especially true of millennials and Gen Xers. Young people were especially had to kind of watch their nickels more closely. And admitted to doing so. Again, I think that's actually a positive thing. Just last little comment is, I think that social research is so fun and interesting, what people are willing to admit, because again, there's this idea of, is it a higher number? Is it in reality, are more people experiencing financial stress? There's some good social research that shows that sometimes financial stress is less about the actual dollars in your bank account and more about your posture towards it. Like people can have a lot of money in the bank account and be super stressed about trying to hold on to it. Some people can, or
nothing, and not be worried, right?
That's right, exactly. So I think there is such an important role for the church to play in giving people continued theology of money, especially during a time of disruption like this. And again, young people sort of at the forefront of these issues and concerns. Not that money is an ageless question, but certainly young millennials, Gen Xers are sort of dealing with some of those things. So the pandemic hit some families, some households especially hard. Some people especially hard. It's not the universal experience, but a very important sort of conversation we're about to have here with Rachel in terms of what do we make of all this?
Well, you've talked about a theology of vocation, which I think is so important. A theology of money is too, and just preaching about money is not necessarily a theology of money. By the way, Barna is doing an Accelerating Generosity collab. It's a 6-week cohort for church leaders that will help you maximize year-end giving. So it's very, very timely, and it will help you activate non-givers and go into 2022 with a more secure and strategic future financially. So you can sign up as always at barna.com/collab. Use the promo code ChurchPulse15 for a special discount. That's barna.com/collab, and use the coupon code ChurchPulse15. Well, I am excited to have Rachel Cruze on this podcast for the first time. She's a 2-time #1 national bestselling author, a financial expert, and host of the Rachel Cruze Show. She has appeared on Good Morning America, The Today Show, and Live with Kelly and Ryan, among others. Since 2010, Rachel has served at Ramsey Solutions, where she teaches people to avoid debt, save money, and budget, and how to win with money at any stage in life. Rachel, it's so great to have you.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So any reaction to, we went through 17 stats in 14 minutes. I don't know. It was a lot, but any reaction to the broad strokes of what David was sharing, Rachel?
It was interesting. I think when the pandemic hit, I remember so well. It was like April of 2020, and it was the complete unknown, right? It was the beginning of
Mm,
everything. Everything is shut down, and from a financial standpoint, what people were longing for and the information they wanted is this going to be a 2008 repeat? Like, is everything going to just absolutely crash? Is the housing market going to fall out again? Like, what is going to happen? And that big question mark was there. And it's kind of weird to say though, as we've gone on, even though it's been 18 months, for me, that question mark is still there because as you look at the stats from April of 2020 to April of 2021 to now where we're at, towards the end of this year, it's still this fluid response. People are still a little fearful. There's still industries that are completely bottom out. So people lost their jobs, just what you guys were saying, that, things were so disrupted. And that 14% of people that were like, yeah, my entire financial life looks different now, from an income perspective, probably because they were part of one of those industries. And it still is this new normal. We're still trying to figure it out. And so there's that hesitancy, which I think affects a lot of things. I think it affects the consumer side. I think it affects the giving, all of it. So it's all just it's still a little bit of that waiting game. And I think people are feeling that. And that's why they're kind of holding their money tightly in all areas of life.
well, I'd love your take on this because, you brought me back to those opening weeks of the pandemic. I don't think anyone would have predicted on any level that this is where we would end up, even in terms of the economy. I mean, the stock market cratered the most it had in over a decade. Unemployment surged before the government subsidies came in. And, even as David was sharing those stats, David, I was thinking like most of the business leaders I know who were impacted by the pandemic actually took on more debt.
Mhm.
Churches didn't, from what I can tell, like just in the conversations I've been in, churches have kind of held steady and if anything, banked cash, right? But that can lead a church leader into false thinking that, oh, well, we have more money in the bank at our church, therefore everyone, and clearly some people have a lot more money in the bank. I'm not saying this was an equal pandemic at all, but I wonder how much of that uncertainty lingers because even now, then the housing market went nuts, right? Like who would have predicted a housing boom? I would have thought a housing crash. I'm just wondering what, like in all the people that you talk to and you and the people at Ramsey talk to ordinary people every single day, what are the most common issues you've encountered in the last 18 months?
For me, I would say I think fear is number one. I think
Hmm.
there's this element that they are frozen, and fear, it paralyzes people. And so they wanted to, from everything from not invest and pause investing to even cashing out because they were that fearful,
Hmm.
to not giving like they were giving, all of it. And so that fear was a huge part, and trying to talk people off the ledge to say, hey, go back to what you've always known. Because the beautiful thing, I feel like what we hopefully present to people and they can grab on is truth around money. It is biblical principles. And that's the wonderful thing about scripture is it doesn't change. It doesn't matter
Right.
what economy we're in. It doesn't matter what year we're in, what century, what decade, pandemic or not. You can still have faith that when you apply God's principles, what he talks about in scripture, it still works. And that hope, my hope was that subsides the fear to say, okay, let's continue to do what we're doing. And if not anything, for us sitting in our seat, I'm like, this proves that God's principles work, right? Because when everything crashes and hits and you lose your job, yeah, you're going to be freaked out because you don't have a paycheck to go and pay on the debt. You don't have a paycheck to fund, keep paying off Sally Mae. So all these principles of living debt free, living with a plan, having savings and emergency fund, all of these are biblical. And so for me, I'm like, guys, it's not a shaming message, but it is a, hey, I'm telling you, it works. It works. And so putting these in place, is something that is even more crucial today. I mean, even my heart just pounds when I talk about it even faster now because it creates this urgency because of the unknown that we're in. But the beautiful thing is there's not this unknown with scripture. The truth is the
Hmm.
truth. And that is something that I feel like I can stand on even more greater today than even before the pandemic.
So Barna does a lot of research, but you've done some research as well. And so the Ramsey Group conducted a study on the state of debt that you released recently. Would love to know some of the top level learnings that you learned about debts and Americans.
Well, the average consumer, or the average American, I should say, has $34,000 of debt. And so what we're finding is boomers are have the least
Hmm.
amount of debts.
Okay,
And
can you
then it
define
goes,
debt that doesn't include, like, what is consumer debt? I just
yes.
don't
So
want to
we are
throw that out.
yes. So we're counting student loans, personal loans, car loans, credit card debt, and mortgages.
Got
I
it.
think were the big sections of the debt in the study. And
And
so
mortgages included in that $34,000 or excluded?
mortgages of that stat, no, excluded.
Excluded. Okay,
Yes,
got
of
it.
that. But when you look at as an entirety, yes, of the generational differences. And so
Got it.
seeing just looking at each generation and the amount of debt that they have, student loans is still number one for everyone. No matter whether you're a boomer, Gen Xer, or millennial, it
So
is still
boomers
that.
still have student loans?
Yes, on average 35,000, because a lot of them did the Parent Plus loans where they took on their child's debts and co-signed basically, right? And so a lot of that risk is now on the parent, the boomers. So some of them is their debt from school, but a lot of it is because of that millennial generation that went. And millennials have the least amount of student loan debt. It's such a problem in that instance when you look at the dollar amounts and you look at these generations, and it's something that I think people just are comfortable with. I think student loan debt is this lie that we've believed as a culture that you just can't go to school without taking out loans. So people are okay with that. They're least okay with the credit card debt and the car loans because they're like, oh, they feel that friction, but it's almost like this acceptance of the student loan. So they're not in a rush to pay it off. And also because it has lower interest rates. But one of my favorite parts of this study that I found that in my line of work that I think is so fascinating is they said 1 out of 4 consumers that they researched and studied said that they had jealous type feelings, envy, if you will, for people that had debt-free lifestyles. And they had that more than being envious of cars, stuff, or vacation. And so I loved when I read that because I thought, man, there is something to be said about keeping up with the Joneses. I think that's like, the term that will forever live on. We will always, there's an element of us always comparing ourselves to what people have and what their lifestyle is. But it gave me a little bit of a refreshing where I was like, okay, so the idea of not having stress, not having financial risk and being debt free is getting more and more appealing than just the cars that are sitting in the driveway or the vacations that are posted on Instagram. So there was a little bit of glimmer, and the debt levels, all of it has been pretty consistent over the past few decades. Nothing major, spiked up. Obviously, student loans are still on the rise, but I find that fascinating that people's perspective on seeing someone, oh wow, they're debt free, they have less stress, maybe not all the stuff, but they envy that type of lifestyle versus the latter.
That is encouraging. What trends did you see across generations? Big differences between millennials, Gen X, boomers?
Honestly, not a ton. I mean, it's again, when you look at the graphs, it's student loans are still number 1, car loans are number 2, and then credit card debt is there as a third for all 3 generations that were pulled. So it seems like, it's funny because it is so normal. The consistency across all the generations are pretty much there. Not major dollar amount swings. I think it's a $2,700 difference between Gen Xers and millennials on debt level. I mean, so it's not this huge gap. And so for me, I want to just shake that up because I see we're just learning. We're not learning from our mistakes, right? It's kind of like this repeat lifestyle. And it kind of feels like it is what it is. And I'm like, man, if you can get in there and just, whether it's a generational idea of a mindset change or a cultural idea of a mindset change, to say, man, this could look so different. This could look
That's
so
a
different.
lifestyle, right? It's just a lifestyle now.
Yeah.
This is just what you do, and this is how you live, and you have a right to a credit card out of college, and you'll keep it until you're a baby boomer and the whole deal. Any insight, either anecdotally or statistically, on the emotional impact of the financial situation in America?
What's saying, well, the stress level obviously has risen majorly, and people freezing. I mean, the fear we kind of talked about earlier is part of that. And so seeing that stress on all generations, and they kind of all react in a very similar way, and that is that they pull back from savings. The savings rate went down. The credit card debt went up. And as you guys said earlier, the giving, went down. And so it is something that is so real. It's part of our human condition, right? Money is a tool, and some people use it, worship it, right? It's the end all be all for them, which is unhealthy. And then some people are just fearful of it in general and don't want to touch it. But the moment that foundation starts to shake, and you think, man, this one thing that I feel like I could have depended on is now has a big question mark around it, and I don't know what to do. You see that scarcity mindset just play in again, grabbing hold of that money, not saving, not giving, and even wanting just to hold on to some cash, if any, and just charging even lifestyle and credit cards because they'd rather have the debt feeling than losing cash. So you see that cycle. And again, it was very similar habits that we saw in 2008 as well in the recession.
So interesting. One of the things we've studied quite a bit on is, kind of you referenced this earlier in terms of college debt. And when we interview 20 somethings, there's this notion that they are hesitant to sort of get married or start a life until they're sort of more financially set, which is an interesting sort of putting the caboose before the engine, right? Because and for some people they're called to singleness, or there's obviously reasons why some people get married or some people don't, but marriage is such an incredible way of building wealth and sort of creating financial security. You don't have to, get financial security in order to be married. So there's lots of interesting things there. I wonder what sorts of issues you're sort of seeing and interacting with, how any of that sort of changed during the pandemic. If you've heard, whether it's on marriage or school debt, sort of school loans, like, are you seeing any kind of positive movement, especially among younger people, towards how to think about these bigger questions of the stages or sequencing or the dominoes of life?
Well, I've seen the exact same studies that you just quoted. I mean, we are finding that millennials specifically, they're not purchasing homes, they're not getting married, and they're not having children. And a big part of that is because of their finances. That's what they say. And I'm like you, I'm a proponent. I'm like, listen, wherever you are, have a baby, even if you have debt, because it's a baby, have the baby. If you want to get married. You're not going to, there's this mindset that I want to clean everything up before I start my life. And there's, an element of that's noble. I get, intellectually why people would say that they want to feel a little bit more secure before they go and change into this whole new season of their life. But you're never going to get there. That's the thing with money. You can be this rat in a wheel where you think I'm going to feel secure. And then, you feel like, okay, now I've paid off X amount of debt. And that's when I said I would get married. But now I want to get that raise at work first, it never stops. So you have to live your life. And again, I correlate that all to fear. They're paralyzed, they're frozen. They're not making decisions based on what is best for them in this time of life. You can still get married. Buying the house, that's the one little asterisk I would say, yes, hold off, until you have certain things in place financially before you do that. But when it comes to just living your life, they really are, they're frozen. And two, we're finding in the job market, some of them that have jobs that they hate, that they don't feel called to, they're still staying put because of the income that they're making, and they don't want to make a change. So it is, right. It is this underlying fear that is motivating so many decisions. And it is, I'm not seeing a huge trend the other way, sadly. If anything, it just has continued to be steady. And I think too, people give a nod to, well, they're having kids later, they're getting married later, all of that. And sure, I guess that's statistically correct. But the fact that those decisions are based on a financial standpoint is that's hard. I don't like to see that.
Yeah. What do you think church leaders can do? We got mostly, church leaders who listen in on this. We talked at the beginning, sort of this one in seven Americans who experienced significant financial disruption, 1 in 5 practicing Christians. What would be ways that pastors, leaders could be talking about money and the financial impact of this pandemic? What are some themes that you'd like to see leaders talking about more holistically or in any way?
Yeah, I think acknowledging it is huge, because it is a stress point. So whether it's right or wrong, how we got there, how we didn't, when you can't pay your bills, you're losing sleep at night. When you think I'm working 4 part-time jobs just to make up because of the salary job I lost. It's stressful. It is something that is, it affects people. So I think the acknowledgement of, hey, that it is a heavy burden that Americans are carrying and just trying to survive month to month. But also I think pushing into the uncomfortable topics of money, just in general. A lot of people, they they don't want to talk about it from stage. They don't want to talk about it on a Sunday morning. But that is, I think, a way to love your church so well, to again speak into the truth of what God says about money. I mean, there's more scriptures around money than heaven and hell combined when you see it. So it's an issue. So to me, I'm like, yeah, Jesus talks about it, right? He knows this is going to be something that we're going to struggle with. And so diving into those topics and helping people see, yes, this is an issue and it is a stress point, but here are things and even practical things that you can do to get yourself in a position where money doesn't rule you. And that's the problem, is money is controlling us in so many ways in our culture today. And to reverse that and to say, it's not a God, it's not the thing that's telling me I can actually be in control of it. And the moment you start to do it, I believe the better stewards you are of what God has given you. And it's this positional change as well, this mindset that I'm a manager for what God has given me. And if I'm sloppy with this, scripture says he's not going to give me more to manage, because I'm terrible at managing it now, So to say, okay, how do we steward this well? How do we manage this well? And not just for the good of you and your sleep at night, but honestly for the kingdom of God, like what we can do, the money and the resources that we can do to help change literally the world around us with just dollars. It's an amazing thing. It's not the end all be all, but what this can do can help so many people. So we say around Ramsey Solutions all the time, what could the people of God do for the kingdom of God if they were debt free? If everyone just paid their car payment, gave their car payment every month instead of it to the bank, to the church, like what things would change? And so it's a powerful tool for us to use for good.
Well, as the guy in this conversation who preached for over 2 decades, I can tell you that fear is not just in the lives of the congregation. I had a really hard time coming to terms with even how to talk about money other than, and this is the crutch I think a lot of pastors get into, I will talk about money when we need it. So during the offering, during the building campaign, during the initiative, the project, we talk about money, but every time we open up our mouth and talk about money, and I say this as someone who suffered from that until I figured out a better way, it's like, yeah, give me it. Come on, Rachel, step up. David, step up. I need you. And then, oh, you're not giving, whatever. By the way, just shameless plug for Rachel's latest book. It's called Know Yourself, Know Your Money. Tons, like dozens of pages of great insights that you can actually just preach right in there about the psychology of money. Hundreds, actually, if you look at it, because it was all devised around common objections. If you want insight into the challenges that the people in your church are looking at, get the book. It's fantastic. But now I want to tackle a subject that you and the people at Ramsey Solutions have tackled probably every week for decades, but I want our listeners to hear it. Somebody comes to you and says, we're tight financially. We bought too much car. We bought too much house. I didn't get the raise. I didn't get the promotion. I'm going to cut back on my giving, which is what most people started to do, or some people started to do at the beginning of the pandemic. What is your advice to someone who comes to you and says, I can't afford to give at the level I was giving, or I should cut back on my tithing, get my finances in order, and then I'll give again, and then I'll be generous?
This is a hard one, because my answer is always pretty blunt. And if you know my personality, I'm like, my dad is like the hard, blunt uncle of America. I feel like I'm your friend. Okay. So I want to walk with you. But the blunt statement, and the truth is, I really believe giving is not a math issue. It's a heart issue. And so when you look to see, yes, are people living paycheck to paycheck and they feel like if I can cut out giving, I'll have more dollars? Well, of course, mathematically speaking, yes. But the condition of giving is so much with the heart. And I'm like, okay, is Comcast getting paid and you're not giving? It really does. It shows you when you give, it's a picture of your heart, and people, it is this closed fist mentality. If I can just control what I have, I'm going to cut back, and I'm going to hold this fist so tight, hold onto it so tight. That ends up being the position of your heart. And the lie is that I really think the enemy sits there and pokes at you to say, if I just had more money, I would give. If I just had more money, I would give. And I love John D. Rockefeller. He said, I never would have been able to tithe the first $1 million I ever made if I didn't tithe my first salary, which was $1.50 a week. And so my argument to people is that giving, it has to become a habit no matter where you are financially. And so as big of a proponent as I am of paying off debt and getting an emergency fund in place and setting yourself up well. Giving is still the number one line item in your budget. And I teach that every single time because it changes you. When you give, you start to move on the spectrum of yourself from selfish to selfless. And I really believe selfless people prosper in life. I mean, selfless people are better spouses, they're better parents, they're better team members, they're better pastors, they're better sitting in a congregation. When someone is selfless, they have, I really believe, a fuller, richer life in the depths of who they are. Because, I mean, I always give the example too of just even a conversation, right? Like take money off the table. But when you go to dinner with someone and the entire dinner is about them, I think we've all had these dinners, and you're like, wow, I don't think they asked us one question, or they don't know anything about me, but I know everything about them. And you're kind of just like, oh, it just kind of feels it's off. But when you sit down with people and they engage you, they actually look you in the eye, they actually ask questions and they want to know, you walk away feeling loved, you feel cared for. And so that's a model for me of someone that is selfless. And so when you go back to the dollars and cents, the tactical side of giving, what I really believe that does is that pries open your fist. It gives this open hand mentality and it changes your heart. It changes who you are, because we are created in the image of God. It is so in Genesis that we are created in his image, and he is the biggest giver of us all, right? Giving us his son so that we can have relationship with a perfect and holy God. And so if we're made in his image, we are created to be givers. So when you are giving, even if it's not a lot, and I tell people that, even if it's not a lot, be giving something, because what starts to shape in you, I really believe you become more and more Christ-like. And I don't want to be legalistic about it, or, I hate legalistic stuff. So I'm like, there's a lot of grace in this. There's a lot of grace, and people are having really tough times. But my plea to people would be, do not stop giving. Even if you have to lower the amount a little bit for a little bit, okay, you can do that, but continue to give, because it really does. It's a posture of your heart and your spirit.
Yeah, I found in my own life, Rachel and David, that the biggest antidote to greed, because greed is really hard to see in the mirror, but I know I've got it. Like, it's just generosity. That when it hurts a little bit to give, when you're like, ooh, that's, and it depends on your income. When I started out as a student, it wasn't a whole lot, but it still hurt. And these days I want it to still make me think twice, go like, but otherwise I'll spend it on me. I promise you 100%. I'll find something to spend it on.
Me too, Carey. I'm like, I'm guilty of that 100%. Yes.
Oh yeah. So it's a one line item on the budget that if it's sacrificial, it's like, okay, I'm dying to myself there, which I think is a good discipline. A lot of pastors struggle with getting Gen Z now, and certainly millennials, on board with giving. You've got the elder generation who very generous. They give out a duty. You've got boomers who are generous. Gen X, to some extent, is probably in most churches of leaders listening, the economic engine of their church, but everyone gets a little bit nervous around millennials and Gen Z. Have you got any advice for pastors on how they might talk to those next generations, who basically are everybody between 20 and 40 now in your church, about giving, and where you've seen some success, some track record of generosity there?
Yeah, those generations I feel like are the ones that are the most socially aware and socially conscious, right? They're the ones that want to buy coffee from someone that's going to be giving to Africa, right? I mean, like they're a little bit more of that fluid. So I would say as transparent as a pastor feels comfortable from stage to explain what you're doing with the giving. I think it's scary for a younger generation to say, I'm going to just give into this black hole that I have no clue what it's going to. Is the pastor just hoarding it all and he's taking it home? You see all this like craziness, on social media, or like, certain people in your head, you're like, oh yeah, he's getting a private jet. That's what he's doing. He's hoarding all this money over here. So if they know what you're giving to, in my church, I'll give them props, does a beautiful job of this. I mean, they have certain things. Foster care is one of their big initiatives, and they talk about how they tithe the tithe. So when the giving comes in, 10% of that, it's a single mom ministry within Cars. It is within the foster care system here in Tennessee. I mean, they have specific lanes that where your money's going. And so for me, I guess probably because I grew up in this bubble, maybe financially, that I'm like, I'm okay if my money goes to pay the pastor's salary. I'm great if it's going to pay the light bill to keep the lights on. Like, I want the church to function. I love the local church. So for me, I don't have an issue with that. But the people that I've been talking to, or that I am interacting with, it's this unknown that I think is a little scary. So for pastors, I would say as transparent as you can be of what the money, where it's going and what it's doing, the budget and what it looks like, I think will help ease some of that, give some peace to that. And on a very tactical level as well, setting up things that are easy for them to give, right? So like there's no more passing the offering plate and writing a check. Like that's what those are my memories of
Hey,
church
make your
growing up.
checks out post dated too. It's like, sorry, what's a check?
Yeah, that's right. 100%. Yeah. So having some easy ways for them to practically give, I think is helpful. I mean, obviously, whether it's an app, online, whatever that looks like, but making it on a tactical basis easy for them to get in that rhythm, I think is helpful as well.
I have been in places. I'm so glad you raised that, because that's something we started focusing on about a decade ago at Connexus Church, where I'm founding pastor. And, in the last 5 years, I've been in places where I wanted to give, but I have no cash. I don't have a checkbook, and I'm like, well, I can't. And then by the time you're in the parking lot, you forget about it. So often we assume it's intent. We assume they don't want to, but people don't carry cash and they don't write checks. And if your website is like 17 steps to give online, they're going to quit at step 2. So how do you make it easy for that? I think is a really good question. Pastors are also struggling financially a little bit in this season. It's been hit hard because we do have the social media stuff where it's like, oh, look at the guy with a Lamborghini and whatever. That's like 0.001% of pastors. Most pastors are probably underpaid or adequately paid. And it's a struggle. So what would you say to pastors who are feeling financial pressure themselves in this season? What would be 1 or 2 steps? Because I've lived with margin and without it. I remember how tense it was without margin. It's awful. And how much better it is with margin. So what would you say? Because winning the lottery is not an option, and you're probably not going to get that huge salary. How do you live with margin in a case like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think what's interesting, I can talk to, a teacher making a teacher salary, or a pastor, maybe that makes a similar dollar amount, but the mindset is so different. And I think for some pastors, they don't even engage the subject within their church, but they also don't engage it in their own personal life. Because money is scary, right? I mean, there's so many warnings about it. I mean, we're all aware of it. And so I would say, though, is what you can do to step in to your own personal household and take control over that is going to provide that margin. And so practical things, I mean, even just like a budget, right? And I would say this to a teacher or a pastor, but it is amazing how many people they just, they month to month, it's like they pay the bills and then that's about it. And they have no clue where the money's going. And so as diligent as you can be, it says in the Old Testament to know the state of your flocks and your herds, know what you have, and just living intentionally on a budget is going to feel like you got a raise already, and to be able to set yourself up well. So, I mean, that's a very practical step, Carey, but it is one that I would tell anyone, because again, when you don't know where it's going, it is so hard to control it. And so as much as you can say, okay, here's where every single dollar is going. And that may mean, hey, you look up and it's like, God, we may have to cut things here for a little bit, cut some of the lifestyle, or maybe you have more than you realize and you just don't realize how much is leaving here and there on this spontaneous giving, throughout the month. You don't know until you know. So as much as you can, controlling every single dollar is going to give you a level of peace and a practical, tactical game plan to know if the income is too low and the expenses are too high.
David, any final thoughts or final word as we wrap up?
No, it's been so fun to get to interact with you today, Rachel, and appreciate all that you're doing. And especially, I feel like the practical side of helping, my heart for millennials, Gen Z, this generation that the church is in some ways sort of left behind, and it gets left behind in some of these very practical things like marriage and childbearing and money and trying to give them practical tools to do this now especially in this new world. And then I see it with my own kids, 22, 20, and 17. I feel like getting them through college, I feel sort of like that was going to be my, sort of the finish line. But now it's like, oh no, I really need to try to help them through you're never done being a parent, but like just the notion of helping to get them settled into their real lives, their non-student lives is such an important part. So I'm just feeling a lot of those things, and the pandemic has shaken some of those things to the core for me. What it means to be a good parent, to be a good giver. I'm sort of listening to this, both listening to your answers, both from the perspective of, what we can do to help leaders in churches, but also like, what does this mean for, for our household and other households that, that I care about. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Highly recommend Rachel's latest book, Know Yourself, Know Your Money. It's got lots of practical things. And actually it works on the personal level. Like if you're trying to figure out your personal finance, but also it's got a lot of practical examples and strategies and content. If you are looking for something to fill a sermon that is more than just, hey, give us your money, you're going to find that really, really helpful. Also a reminder, leaders, about the Generosity Collab that Barna is putting on. It's 6 weeks. We'll get you ready for year-end giving. We'll get you set up for 2022. It's practical. It's interactive. And if you want in, you can get a discount by using the coupon code ChurchPulse15 and going to barna.com/collab. That's barna.com/collab. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of Church Pulse Weekly. If you enjoyed it, listen again by subscribing, share it with a friend, let Rachel and David know that you appreciate